Yep,
Can you hear me?
we can hear you perfectly, yes.
Thanks. Just give me a second. In 3, 2, 1. I want to first point out that this debate isn't about taxing the rich because there are many ways in which we can tax the rich through things like wealth tax, for instance. What this debate is really about is about speculation and about preventing bubbles from being formed at the trade off of things like economic growth. I want to firstly note that people often keep assets and they don't sell those assets because they believe that the assets will continue to grow more and more, and eventually people will turn a larger amount of profit. This often creates bubbles that governments can't really handle, and that's why there's a need to impose this tax on unrealized gains. As framing, this debate has the largest delta on speculative markets in which like the value of assets exponentially increases over time. Places like the housing industry, for instance, or the tech industry are good examples of where this debate has the largest delta. And the reason for that is because in terms of like your regular assets that aren't highly speculative, those are unlikely to be heavily affected by unrealized gains in the first place. In terms of policy, the way that taxation on unrealized gains looks like a progressive tax on unrealized gains. That is to say that if the value of the unrealized gains continue to increase, the taxation on it will be increased even more, like progressively. Okay, with that said, we only have one argument in opening government. We explain to you how this reduces the speculation within bubbles and why that's important in this debate. We think that bubbles are formed when people often perceive the value of an asset to be more than the actual value of the asset. And the reason why bubbles are formed is because there are often heavy amounts of speculation surrounding that asset. There are a few reasons why there's often high amounts of speculation that the governments just can't address. The first reason is because of optimistic growth. That is to say that because people view the economy as doing well, that's the point in which people are more willing to invest into assets and assets in general. The problem is that when people see the economy doing well, that's when they think that their assets are likely to grow higher, which means that they pour more money into investing into speculative assets, and they continue to hold on to those assets while selling them. The second reason is because often the industry experts who are the ones who own these assets want to increase the speculation of their assets so they can sell those assets even more. That is to say that if you hold on to a piece of like asset like a house, for example, you are incentivized to increase the speculation in the market insofar as you can sell it for a higher profit later on. As a result, speculation often goes out of hand. Often the value of goods go beyond what the goods are actually worth, and there's a lot of incentive to increase the speculative nature of the assets that you currently own. This results in bubbles being formed. The problem is that governments often have a very large difficulty in determining what is a bubble and what's not a bubble, because it's quite difficult to actually determine whether or not a piece of good is like way more is valued way more than its actual value. Like for example, if there's a McDonald's burger that costs $5, there is actual cost is $5, but it increases to $50 because like 50 people really want it. The problem is that it's very difficult for the government to determine whether or not the increase in price is because of like demand and supply factors, or whether or not it's actually because of things like high amounts of speculation that exist. Therefore, often bubbles are really only identified after the bubble has actually burst. So governments have a very difficult time trying to deter the level of bubbles that are being created. At the same time, the way in which governments try to address speculation and try to reduce speculation and address bubbles right now is through things like increasing inflation in order to stifle economic growth. But the problem is that doing that worsens the general economy of the country as a whole, which is why it's very difficult to deal with bubbles in general. Before I continue, I'll take OO.
Yeah, so the way you actually get rid of asset bubbles is by getting better price discovery so that people actually know what the valuation of a stock. And the way you get better price discovery is by not kind of like shielding the perception of the value of the stocks you're investing in with a really dumb tax.
Firstly, this is quite difficult to do in general because, again, it's very hard to determine whether the increase in prices of a good is because of demand and supply factors or whether or not it's because of high levels of speculation. But the second thing to note is that the giving accurate price description on items really only works for low value assets. They are not really part of this debate because this is about highly speculative markets, things like housing, for instance, where it's very difficult to determine what's the actual cost of that piece of asset in the first place. What happens therefore when bubbles are formed? The first issue is that at the point where bubbles burst, because they will eventually burst, they will burst at the point in which like people realize that the speculative value of the good is just way higher than its actual value. That's the point where bubbles burst. And when bubbles burst, a lot of people lose their jobs, a lot of people lose their investments because they lose a lot of money they lose a lot of the money they invested into these kinds of assets. But more importantly, secondary industries are also affected. Industries that are reliant on the primary asset that formed the bubble in the first place. So for instance, if the housing industry were to crash, that affects other industries such as the construction industry and so on. How then does this policy deal with this? We want to note that a tax imposition on unrealized gains is likely to slow down the growth of bubbles in two ways. The first is that it's likely to dissuade people from heavily investing in this kinds of highly speculative industry. And therefore, people are just less likely to invest in these kinds of things, which means that the demand for these assets drop while the supply generally stays the same or increases. That means to say that the overall value of the good decreases, which is a good thing because it reduces speculation. But the second thing to note is that people are more incentivized to sell their assets insofar as they want to avoid the taxation on the unrealized profit from that asset. So people are just more willing to sell towards the markets, which generally reduces the speculative price of that good. Therefore, as a result, you're able to combat bubbles effectively with a tax imposition on the unrealized gains of assets. Why are we willing to take the trade-off of economic growth? Because we recognize that insofar as people are willing to invest lesser, there are a few reasons why we're willing to take a trade-off. The first reason is because a progressive tax on unrealized gains means to say that the impact on economic growth is already far lower because people will still be willing to invest insofar as they feel that they can still get some money out of it, just don't want to invest in highly speculative markets, or they're more incentivized to sell their asset. But the second reason is because economic growth tends to benefit people at the top, people with the most capacity to invest in the first place, people who are rich, for example, but don't really benefit people who are poorer. The problem is that when the bubble bursts, it tends to affect the most vulnerable actors in the world. It tends to affect people who are poor, who are reliant on jobs in general. Those people lose their jobs when bubbles burst, which is why we think we're willing to take a trade-off of some rich people not making a lot of money in comparison to poor people being able to just survive because they still have their jobs and so on. But lastly, I think the scale of impacts of bubble bursting is far greater than a slight slowdown in the economic growth of a country. For these reasons, we propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for that fine speech. Can I please call upon the Leader of Opposition to begin the side for their House? Hear.
Yeah, I'll take POIs verbally. If I drop out at any point, please let me know. I'm still on my hotspot from the fire alarm situation, so apologies in advance. Unfortunately for OG, the only constructive that they're hedging their bets on doesn't work in this case. I want to do three things in my speech. First, I'm going to do refutation on why just the linking in the OG case doesn't make sense and therefore they should automatically be out of this round. Then move on to my own case. First, on how this harms all small businesses and why this is incredibly bad. Secondly, on how investing becomes much more short-termist and why that is also bad for the majority of people. First, let's talk about OG then a little bit. OG's largest push is essentially just that with this tax, we're now able to do things like burst bubbles a lot easier because people are less incentivized to do things like invest in short-term in unrealized gains. The issue with this, and the issue that my partner correctly pointed out in his POI, is that bubbles aren't generated by things bubbles aren't fixed by doing things like taxing assets, because bubbles are generated by poor perception of wealth increases, right? OG had to prove why taxing them is linked to somehow changing the perception of these bubbles and therefore leads to these bubbles being popped. Because they weren't able to do so, the entirety of their case doesn't exactly make sense, because the most wealthy people can still continue to invest in unrealized gains and simply not and continue propelling the bubble forwards, especially when it's in an industry such as tech, when it's in an industry such as housing, when sometimes, in some cases, their growth is able to perhaps outpace the taxes that are placed on them. Okay, on to my points then. First, harms on small businesses, then on investing becoming more short-termist.
Point.
I want you to later. I want you to imagine a small business owner that is currently trying to rent a location to start their business. And the only mechanism for them to be able to do so is to do so from like equity financing. And they are simply unable to do so because the angel investors that they could rely on our side of the house, the people that would have loaned the money on our side of the house and invested equity in them, now are unwilling to do so because of this type of gains tax. And for example, I want you to think of people want to start businesses and are like now unable to do so because their immense risk is being taxed into the ground, and they're no longer able to see the value in investing in these businesses or these ideas that they have, therefore like making it so that innovation is massively unrealized within our society. Why do we think that small businesses are significantly harmed on our side? And why do we think they're harmed unjustly? We think that the majority of small businesses try to grow by investing in equity, right? So in the status quo, they do things like rely on angel investors and other funds, which benefit greatly from investing in risk to realize their gains. And the only reason they do so in the status quo is that the potential gains they have are far outweighed by the potential losses because they don't have to do things like getting taxed. What changes on government side of the house is that now that like these unrealized gains are going to be taxed, all of the money that they're putting into like other small businesses that they're currently using to do like angel investments now becomes far, far more risky because even if they're able to make gains, these gains are now no longer able to cover the cost of any of the other investments they're doing. So the risk of every single investment increases exponentially on government side of the house. This obviously means that like these small businesses are no longer able to finance through equity, or these small businesses are now significantly harmed like in their ability to finance through equity. Why is this so important? Because we think that for many small businesses, they can only really finance through equity. Oftentimes they have a very hard time taking out loans. When we have to think about small businesses and the magnitude of loans that they need to take out in comparison to perhaps their credit rating, their ability to, take out collaterals, because oftentimes these small businesses are started by people who, just have very big dreams and very good ideas, but very little assets to their names, that oftentimes the only mechanism for them to be able to get these businesses off the ground in the first place is to rely on equity that government now systematically removes from them. Why do you think this is more important than, I don't know, all of like everything that OG talks about when they talk about, risk being very bad and how we don't really care about economic growth? Because the thing is, this is a lot more than about economic growth and about risk. We think that when we're talking about small businesses, we're talking about, firstly, people's livelihoods, but secondly, the ability for society to create innovation. It's probably not very good if the entirety of like, even in OG's best case, everyone is simply investing in like blue chip companies and not encouraging investment to happen. We think that this is the world which decreases competition and just generally is not good. Before I move on to my second point, I'll take OG.
The assets of smaller companies aren't large anyways, which means that the growth of the unrealized gain of holding assets of small companies isn't large. Given that most of these taxes on unrealized gains is progressive, this isn't likely to affect smaller companies much.
The problem is with that is that it doesn't consider firstly the amount of time that you need by OG's own model, that you probably need to keep your money in there to see returns on it, which just makes a lot of the investments not worth it to these people. But secondly, it also doesn't consider the fact that it's not necessarily about just simply the flat proportion of tax that you have to pay, but also the risk that this considers, right? So entire industries like angel investment industries probably no longer exist on your side of the house because nobody sees it as worth it to be investing in these small businesses, which oftentimes especially if they're tech companies, they need a lot of equity in order to finance their R&D. But secondly, though, investing becomes a lot more short-termist. This is also quite bad, right? We think that when business investments become much more volatile and can't depend on equity to raise capital, key stakeholders are now way more incentivized to do things like prioritize short-term gains, because the gains that they would have been able to see long-term through the investment of businesses are now being taxed to the ground, right? This is incredibly important because short-term gains, we think, are for example, the stock markets, etc., are already incredibly volatile. And oftentimes a lot of people implicated within unrealized gains are very, very vulnerable. So we're thinking about things such as pension funds like RESPs, where people put their money into unrealized gains because they can protect it, because they can hold on to it for long term at very little cost to themselves. We think they're no longer able to do this under Gov side of the house, right? When they say you have a progressive tax, or when they say that the tax scales according to the amount of time that you hold this asset for, when this turns off a lot of people from being able to invest in these long-term assets and being able to actually invest into their futures. And oftentimes these people are people that depend on places like hedge funds or trust funds to manage their money, and now they're no longer able to count on them because they have their own kind of like incentives to no longer like pay the taxes on these types of unrealized gains, whereas now they might be able to actually represent their clients' best interest rather than prioritizing these short-term gains. Why is this incredibly important then? Well, obviously, I don't want to say like the cliche stuff about it's people's retirement money, it's people's educational money, it's the money that people like a regular average people have been putting into their accounts for maybe decades in order to save for their future. But that's the truth of it. We think that it's incredibly important that people are not turned off from investing in long-term assets, and we're only able to do that if we don't have a tax on these unrealized gains. Opposition.
Thank you, Elo, for that fine speech. Can I please call upon DPM to close up OG for this debate? Here, here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Cool. I'm sorry if there's a bit of background noise. I'll try my best to speak over it. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. Speculation on these assets typically rely on things like arbitrary measures that are easy to skew speculation. This looks like, for example, location within the housing industry. Wayne, in his PM speech, has given you multiple incentive analysis to tell you why they are likely to be able to do this. Opening opposition doesn't respond to this. They don't even give you any sort of characterization as to why people want to do this, and they don't tell you why it's inherently a good thing. Recognize that what happens on opening government is that taxing dissuades speculation because the people that have these assets want to keep as much money as possible. The reason for this is because it's the most proximate benefits towards them. This motion therefore changes their perception by making them not want to increase their valuation, only for them to lose out more money, because they realize that after they increase the valuation too much, they are actually going to be able to lose more money through taxing rather than how much they're actually going to be able to make for this. All of this was unresponded to by opening opposition. The only response that we really got from them is that this is not how you solve bubbles. We think that this is, one, extremely dismissive, and secondly, doesn't deal with the bulk of the analysis that came out with Wayne. But even then, even if there's already some form of like status quo measures against bubbles, it doesn't hurt to have more more measures against forming bubbles. And with all the reasons that Wayne already has given you, I don't think that this is a sufficient response. Therefore, going on to their case, I have two things that I want to deal with. One is this idea about small businesses and how we are somewhat harming them. And secondly is the idea of investment and how on our side, we're actually going to be able to decrease the bubble and we're going to be able to help increase stability. The first clash is therefore on small businesses, and this was the main bulk of opening opposition's case. The problem with this is that, first of all, it's deadlocked against like Wayne's second substantive about how this actually harms secondary industries, because it's somewhat symmetric, right? Like they're like both sides are gonna harm some form of industries. So if I break this and I therefore go against this claim, I think we are quite clear above them. I have two responses to this. One is that this doesn't really occur in small businesses because they don't really have like unrealized values, because they usually have to make things like, for example, their goods and services somewhat transparent. They have to like generally be like, they just have to be transparent in accordance to like the law, especially when it comes to like what kind of products they have. I'm a little bit unclear as to this. But the second response is just that like their only way that they said that they're going to be able to do this is through financing of equity. But this is very unrealistic because small businesses need real cash in order to actually like set up. The angel investors don't just give them equity. They have to give them like some form of cash in order for them to be able to start their businesses, right? Like this is just a very realistic and very intuitive claim. But the only thing is that if this does happen, equity only finances and only helps the bigger businesses, because you need some form of capital in order for you to be able to utilize the equity in the first place, which I don't think that smaller businesses naturally have the capital. In this case, it's extremely unclear as to why we should prioritize this like bigger businesses that only use equity versus the actual people on the ground that have a much more proximate harm, which comes up in Wayne. It's extremely unclear what their main benefit is. The second thing that I want to deal with is this idea of investment and how we are going to be able to slow down economic growth. I have two main responses to this. One is that there are already a bunch of incentives for people to want to invest. Things like, for example, one, gaining more money. Secondly, having some form of long-term profit. Third, the actual maintenance of the asset. So if like you buy a house, you actually get like a house, and this is a pretty cool thing, right? The problem comes in when there are too many incentives that are used by rich people and they actually screw over the poor, and they actually screw over the economic growth and the amount of investment that they're actually able to get, right? I think that in this case, it's like the tipping point in this is that we just are able to kind of like slow down and to make them reconsider how much they actually want to value and whether or not this economic, like the speculation is inherently something that's worth. But the second response to this is that even if this is true, I'm not too sure why this is bad, because if you really listen to what LO has said, she doesn't really deal with this. She just kind of asserts that this doesn't happen, right? But if anything, on our side, what we've proven to you is that one, we're able to reduce a bunch of bubbles. And this is good, right? Because you're able to like have increased stability. You're actually able to like slow down the economic growth. You're able to allow people to actually maintain their jobs. People on the ground that are going to be fucked over by the unrealized gains are now able to actually like have a higher amount of benefit on our side because they're actually not going to be able to be screwed over to a greater extent. But the second thing is just that this reduces a bunch of wastage of resources, right? So what actually happens inside opposition is that you have a bunch of these assets that are just not going to be used and other than like for investment purposes, because they see that this is what happens. Like we see this in a bunch of like different housing crises all around the world, like in Australia and like in China. We think that what actually happens on the counterfactual is that people are more likely to be able to like use these houses, or like the people that are going to be able to like buy them are the ones that are going to be able to use these houses to a greater extent. Before I go on to my last part, any POIs from closing? Okay, anyone from opening?
Yeah, so like you're still not hedging against the economic conditions just by charging a tax on the gains from something. But also, I think like for the vast majority of OG, you're talking about a capital gains tax, not an unrealized gains tax. What's the difference between the two?
I mean, when you see the unrealized gains, you just like possibly tax it. Like when you see it on paper, I think this was kind of clear in Wayne. I'm not sure why I have to like make it clearer in my speech. But even then, I feel like everything that you're saying in your POI has already come up in Wayne. So I'm not too sure exactly what the response is. The last thing that I just want to say is that even in the worst case scenario on our side, I think that it's more important that we trade off rich people getting more money over the actual people on the ground that are more likely to be able to suffer. People from the secondary industries, people that are going to be able to lose their jobs. There are two reasons why this is more important than any of the benefit coming up from opening opposition. One is because this is extremely more long-term and it's a lot more stable than anything that they're saying. Because their main bet that they're pushing on and their main path to victory is that this is going to screw over small businesses. But I'm unsure to what extent this is true. And if anything, why this small businesses therefore have to take priority over a bunch of the vulnerable stakeholders that already came up in Wayne. But the second thing is just because we have a lot more we have the more vulnerable group on our side. If you listen to a bunch of Wayne's analysis and he tells you why they're able to screw over more vulnerable individuals, it is more important in this case that we take priority towards them and we actually allow them to gain a more proximate benefit to make sure that these people are taken care of to a greater extent rather than to benefit the people that are only at the top, which opening opposition necessarily does. For all those reasons, Gov.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for that fine speech. Can I please call upon DLO to close up OO on the top half as a whole? Here, here.
Hi, am I good?
Yep.
Thank you. So as I addressed in my POI, the vast majority of OG is talking about this capital gains tax, where when you sell your asset, like when you liquefy the asset or the equity or whatever, then you pay a tax. Unrealized gain taxes are when you're paying taxes just for holding on to the asset that has unrealized gains. Because the asset has grown in value over time, you're not paying a tax on this. And as OG frames, this tax will be greater and greater depending on the amount that you actually gained. So let's chat about this then, because OG seems to think that this is going to help us deal with asset bubbles. And I think that Jackie's already given a pretty good response to what was honestly a pretty flippant case coming from OG as well. But let's just think about this. There's a humongous problem solution mismatch when dealing with asset bubbles when you're just charging a tax on people who are making money from stocks. Because first off, stocks can be undervalued. And then when you invest in the stock and you make a return on your investment, that's just a return on investment. That's not the creation of an asset bubble. That's correcting the price of the stock to something that actually makes a lot more sense. Now, let's talk about when stocks are overvalued, and then people sell the stock, and eventually it goes back down to its normal value. That's also the correction of a stock. An asset bubble is when we incorrectly evaluate a stock at a significantly higher price than it actually should be valued. And those are the instances when it's actually harmful. But let me ask you this. How is it that implementing a tax is going to cause people to now better perceive and better understand the real value of different stocks? This makes absolutely no sense. We get no explanation from OG except to call my partner bad, which give Cutter some slack. She's debating in the middle of the field. Secondly, we actually flip this argument from on asset bubbles as well, because what we tell you is the way we get rid of asset bubbles, or how we hedge against these asset bubbles, is by increasing the liquidity within the market. So way more people are able to access these investments. So price discoveries are able to happen significantly quicker. Because when you have like a lot more investors that are kind of investing within investing in a stock, this means that a lot more people are buying and selling the stock. This means that market fluctuations are going to be more and more accurate, as opposed to a stock that's just kind of being traded by like a couple dozens of people, right? So we get significantly better price discovery at the point which stocks are being held for reasonable amounts of time. They aren't being influenced by external factors to buy and sell, and at the point which people are actually willing to buy them. But let's gut check what happens under this motion. People don't want to buy these stocks anymore because people are, well, I don't know, they're going to be charged a tax on these stocks. So at least a lot of the poor investors who might not be willing to take on the burden of such a tax, or even the wealthier investors who maybe found a better loophole to make money, like these people won't be investing anymore. So you're reducing liquidity on that metric. But secondly, you're also just making these people irrationally sell their stock significantly sooner. As soon as they made some gains, they now want to sell the stock. Not only does this make the stock unbelievably volatile, which I'll talk about the harms to all the actors when you do that, but secondly, this also just makes the stock kind of unattractive. This makes the stock difficult to buy. This means that people are selling this stock before it actually gets valuated correctly. No, thank you. And this means that you're probably not going to correctly appraise what the stocks are, like what the value of all these different things are. So I think that price discovery has better room to like correct in the status quo. But we absolutely flip this argument coming from opening government if they were to say that we get rid of asset bubbles. I agree, asset bubbles kind of suck. I don't know if this is the best way to get rid of them, but if anything, we're the ones who are doing that. The last response to this is just that regulations, sorry, 1 second. Last response to this is just that regulations are also getting significantly better. After 2008, America implemented a whole slew of regulations in order to make sure that different private equity and different investors needed to like adhere to certain rules on like short selling and adhere to certain rules on using financial instruments in a responsible way. And I think that these rules have been largely successful, which is why the types of crashes you've seen in asset bubbles, especially in Western developed economies, has been substantially lower. I think there's good reason to believe that if a politician wants to implement a policy to get rid of asset bubbles, they'd probably implement better regulations than a counterfactual where they didn't implement this really dumb policy. I'll take CG.
So your response doesn't really make sense, because if there is a tax that you need to pay out when you cash out these things, then there's also incentive to not cash out because you also need to pay taxes. So doesn't this harm your whole case?
No, that's a capital gain, and that exists irregardless of what the motion is. As I said, unrealized gains are, no thank you, Wayne, I'm sorry. I have a lot to get through. Unrealized gains are specifically being taxed on something just for simply holding onto this asset. Now, OG seems to think that this also has like no harms to small businesses because they're poor anyway. It doesn't matter. You know what? Small businesses make a ton of money. They depend on this kind of like, okay, you're starting a small businesses. What do? You need investors, and a lot of times there's a combination, some mixture of debt and equity you have to take out. And the equity is often personally funded, and you go to the bank to take out a big loan on a large degree of collateral, and you have to eventually pay back this loan. But the issue is now, when you lose money, it's not like the government's gonna, oh, here, I'll give you some money to make sure that you don't lose as much. Like these taxes get spent in God knows which way. If CG wants to argue these taxes are going to be spent well, or even OG, they have to prove why these taxes are going to be allocated to specifically bailing out the businesses they're fucking over. But now these small businesses that are taking out this collateral, they have to pay an additional tax simply because the valuation of their internal equity, or then maybe their building prices, etc., are increasing in value. Not only is this already kind of reflected if they're paying higher rent, they now have to pay an additional tax, which reduces their ability to pay back the previous loan. This just horribly fucks over the ability for people to kind of enter small businesses in the first place, reducing competition. And small businesses make up like 80% of the American market. Now, the second thing I want to say is this is not just some light tax. If you like observe Kamala Harris's campaign, the plan was to have a 25% tax on all of these issues. If this is what you're supporting under this motion, it's a mass culling of the remaining competition in monopolitopia that we call America. Last but not least, we say this harms other innocent people as well, under pension funds, under people who are just kind of investing for the sake of investing, and they rely on these investments in order to make like future investments. And I'll note the people who are exclusively able to get out of loopholes and are able to kind of avoid these types of tax or these types of constraints are probably the people who can kind of just shift their assets to God knows where. Like if they're paying a capital gains or an unrealized gains tax in this particular country, they can just get rid of those stocks and go buy things in the places where there like aren't these unrealized gain taxes. So the people who are specifically locked out of doing investing in the most profitable way are also going to tend to be the people who are the poorest. Last but not least, we see that people are going to sell these stocks and like after short-term growth, which increases volatility, decreases liquidity, and ruins price discovery. I think we're conclusively winning the top half for a couple of reasons. First, we substantially disprove this idea of asset bubbles, even if CG knows more about the economy than I do, which like fair enough then. I think that I know a little bit more than OG, and like so like given the explanations I've given compared to these apparent reasons that came out of PM, I think that mine were substantially better substantiated. But the second thing we're able to demonstrate in this round is that you just indisputably fuck over the ability for small businesses to leverage their businesses, ruin a ton of people's lives, and there's probably a transitionary period that's very harmful to people as well. Very proud to oppose. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Raymond, for that fine speech, and thanks to everyone for a great top half as a whole. Let's call upon the member of government to begin CG in the back half. Here.
Yeah, I'll take PI's audible, please. Just have some water and set up my net. Yeah, PI is out loud. Top half was more complicated than it needed to be. CG is going to run the simple extension that taxes mean the government makes money. Government having money is good. Money is super adoptable. Quickly, one response to CG to OO before I get into that though. Opening opposition build their case around so they say that basically angel investors have incentives to make money, and this tax means angel investors make significantly less money. Unfortunately, opening opposition also characterized what capital gains taxes are, which also apply to the angel investors. That is, if these angel investors have incentives to make money, and the way that they make money by investing in small businesses is they buy the small businesses, they invest in them, and then they sell the small businesses. When you sell the small business after the small business has grown, you already get taxed if you're in a country that has a capital gains tax, which is most developed economies, as opening opposition characterized. This means that these investors they're talking about are already subject to some degree of tax. They did not position the slight increase in tax or the existence of a tax beforehand relative to the other tax that already exists. So I'm not clear the delta that they have in their case. On to our extension about this tax money. So first premise, governments need tax money right now. A lot of governments around the world are pretty over leveraged. First, because COVID just happened, and so they've just over leveraged themselves, trying to spend to recover and get out of the bump of COVID. And so a lot of them borrowed a lot of money from in order to fix like COVID related recessions, etc. Second, because we just are in a really crazy geopolitical climate right now, like between the Russia-Ukraine situation, meaning oil prices have been quite volatile, between China's deflationary period, which means that they're loaning significantly less money than normal, and between the United States political uncertainty as a result of an election that is incoming, most governments are just significantly not certain, it's just uncertain whether most governments are able to access loanable funds and borrow money to do things like deficit spending when they don't have enough money to spend on their own people. This means that a lot of governments just really need money right now and are pretty cash strapped. Second premise, pre-tax, most of the people who hold these really expensive, most people who hold assets that many people who hold assets that appreciate hold them for too long and never let go of the assets in order to avoid capital gains taxes, which means that the government makes no money off of these, and they just don't get any profit as a result of this. This is because and the reason why most people, like most investors and people, hold assets for slightly too long is first to avoid capital gains taxes that I mentioned earlier. Second, because most people just have optimism bias. That is, you expect and anticipate your asset to do well, and even if it is to do well and to appreciate even more in the future, even if it's already started to appreciate now. And third, because there are just some assets that are like actually getting more valuable. Like if you're owning a house, and the house is getting more expensive, then like you just don't want to sell the asset because the value of this asset is continuously rising. All this is to say that there are a lot of latent assets right now, a lot of assets whose values have been appreciating significantly, and and this is a significant number of assets. And these assets disproportionately belong to wealthier people because they're the ones who can afford to spend money on things that will not on things whose profits they cannot immediately utilize in the short term because they do have extra money for themselves. Like wealthy people are the ones who have their second home. They're the ones who invest significantly in these markets. They're the ones that are characterized by opening opposition as these angel investors as well. This is relevant because it means that the way that the motion is worded is this how supports the imposition of taxes. At the moment of imposition of taxes, you immediately unlock significant amounts of latent capital that it is just waiting around that the government can access. You get a significant boost of cash at a time when governments need it, and it's focused on people who hold lots of assets per OO, who do lots of angel investments, etc. And this is this is better than any alternatives like regarding raising taxes raising a certain kind of tax on that is already existing because it disproportionately affects already wealthy people, and which means that it's not significantly going to hurt the vulnerable people that opening opposition weighs as the most important. And second, because it also doesn't actively hurt anyone because the taxes aren't taking away money. Like the taxes aren't putting people into negatives. All the taxes are doing is cutting positive profits off of someone. And so you're guaranteed that you're not actively hurting people within your country. Before I go on and explain why this money is good, I'll take that POI from yeah, go on.
Thank you. Yeah, if capital gains taxes are like the same thing, but with way less harms to the innocent folks, then you could just raise those. Why does the government specifically need to fuck over these people for apparently their budget concerns?
Sorry, no, they both harm, they both affect the same groups of people, because everyone who invests is affected by both of these taxes because everyone wants to make money, and so so it just affects everyone. So having this money is good because it means that you have the money is just really adaptable. You can use it in a lot of cases. You can use it to help small businesses with things like subsidies. You can use it to help recover from a bubble if it does occur for opening government. And you can also use it just to fix healthcare and proximate issues inside of your country, issues that you might not have the money to spend on right now. Why do governments make good decisions about how to spend this money? First, because because of the stock stuff about popular support. That is, you need popular support in order to pass any policy in government. And a majority of the population is often not the wealthiest of the wealthy. And also majority of the population means you are just generally spending the money in a way that most of the people want the money to be spent, which means you're fulfilling the most preferences and helping the most people. And second is because many governments have robust, all governments, have robust civil servants and civil departments of health and departments within their own government that have technocrats that have spec knowledge on how the money needs to be spent and how to implement policy once parliament, etc., has decided how to spend money in a particular field. Why does this beat top half? First, on uniqueness, because there are other ways to signal to stop bubbles, as was pointed out by OO to respond to OG. And there also are just other ways to invest in small businesses and other incentives that mean that angel investors likely will still invest, such as that there's just an overwhelming amount of profit that means that no amount of tax is going to deter you unless it's 100% tax. And second, because of the degree of change that occurs because the immediate imposition means you get so much money. More specifically, though, why does this beat open in government? First, because OG doesn't prove why existing regulations are insufficient, which means alternatives exist. Second, because it's more quantifiable. OG don't prove the degree to which there's less likelihood of a bubble and how much fewer bubbles you have, but you can quantify how much money we get. And third, given the relative symmetricism of how likely a bubble is, it is more important to have more money because that means you can recover from the bubble. It also beats OO because there are alternate ways for you to access loans, and more money means the state can provide loans, which are also good and effective. Thank you.
Maybe I should unmute myself. Am I audible?
You're audible now that you've unmuted yourself. Yes.
Yeah. Yeet. Mm-hmm. I love CEO's speech, therefore I'll react to it shortly. I want to know that they just say that it's unfair to have government, but I think the alternative is also unfair in the sense that there's no way that you have a natural state in which there's no violence, people just go for themselves, and that kind of stuff. I think then the state implements a couple of rules which are clear for everybody, which create a form of fairness, but also a respectability and a form of like predictableness that normally wouldn't be there. It also makes it possible for rich and strong people not to screw over poor people and weak people because there now are rights, that kind of stuff. The state will not be completely moral, but at least significantly more moral than anything else. The fact that we're able to use these taxes to actually help people on the ground is actually making a tangible change, right? This is able to make people get education, be able to have a house, where on the other side they might not even have a house in the first place. I think to that extent it is clear that taxes are good. They are able to help people, and I'm very happy to be a communist. Okay, now, what's the problem with OG? I think that OG's idea is that you're going to stop bubbles because overall people are going to spend less money less quickly. The problem is they are very flippant towards OO because then they say, but people will still spend money in the economy because they still want to do like get all of this money, they still want to do all of this stuff, and that's why you don't have these like small companies going down. I think the problem of this is what I think already Rian points out is one, it's unclear why this uniquely does this and why you don't get any other policy that already maybe exists as effective. But also, they just never bite the bullet or exploit the skill. Like, yes, it might be a bit slow to invest, but why is the slowness to invest specifically going to allow you to stop bubbles to such an extent that they don't exist anymore? That is a level of analysis that is required for them to talk about this, right? Because it's not just enough to say this. There needs a higher level of specificity there to make these larger claims work. To that extent, I think there's a lot of uncertainties in their case because it also means that they're not unwilling to bite the bullet in the first place about, yes, you're also going to maybe have less investments in general. I think our impacts are a bit more secure, right? It is the moment you tax people, you just get more money. This money oftentimes goes to things such as hospitals. The fact that it goes to like investments in the economy, which means everyone is being helped. Now, there is this idea that maybe this is not going to be spent well, but I think Rian explains that there's already a lot of like debt that we have to really pay off. Otherwise, have a shit ton of insecurity. But also the fact that people have democracies. So people have like a way to kind of like show this, right? They can go into the media and explain that we need this money this way, that we need to give, for example, to the NHS because we need more money to help the nurses, all that kind of stuff. But also, I think there's just a general interest of the state to still help the people, right? The moment you have a better educated workforce, the more money you can extract and the better your economy becomes. The better moment, like the moment you have a better healthcare system, you have better workers who can do more stuff and therefore are overall better. But also, they want to keep these people helpful, either to stay for selfish reasons, to stay in power, or just to be able to, again, extract more tax money from them because they're doing better off. So therefore, the incentive of the states always aligns with the people to make sure they do the best things. And therefore, when you have more taxes, this will go in ways to directly help these people on the ground in a direct way compared to maybe some uncertain ways where maybe bubbles exist, maybe they don't. I don't know how often they are. Yes, they have impact on the economy, sure, but what is the exact delta here? I'll take a PR from OO now, actually.
Yeah, your hospitals, infrastructures, and government investments are downstreams of a chilling effect that slashes people's capacity to earn and reduce the amount of money that is flowing through the system overall. You make the demand for the things that you're trying to solve.
So no, actually, here's the thing. I'll respond to this in a couple ways. The idea that OO says is, but now you're going to stop investing to such a large extent that this is going to harm pension funds, it's going to harm the economy, all this stuff. Note that this, similar to OG, is a huge impact they go for, right? Now, a shit ton of people need to suddenly stop paying these taxes, need to stop like going to invest in the first place. But I think there are structural reasons why you still want to invest in general. One, it is a way to make money. even if I invest and I make now $80 instead of $100, that is still more profit to me. So I still want to invest more in these kinds of things. Secondly, also there's the idea that you kind of like still need assets, right? Companies still need things such as buildings or houses, or also just stocks in the first place, so that when a crisis hits, they have something to like sell off in the first place, and therefore have some form of liquidity and possibility for them to overcome any issues and that kind of stuff. But also they kind of like need this, for example, if they want to expand, right? They want to show that, look, we have all of this capital, which means that we can sell them if we need to. So if we need to have a loan or we need to get help when the government is going to hand out stuff, they can show that you have a possibility to get back on your feet again. Those are structural reasons why you still want to invest. The fact that you slightly need to pay more money, yes, means that you're going to have a bit less investment, but not to the point where you're going to get economic crisis, or you're going to have such a spamming of selling of equity that is now going to harm the economy. I find it a super unrealistic interpretation of how the economy works. Now, what else do they say? They say, you're now going to not invest in companies. I think these investment firms tend to have a preference for giving loans anyway. The reason is quite simple. You are more secure of cash because you always know that you're going to pay it off. But also when, for example, this company goes bankrupt, because you are a creditor who gave a loan, you are much more likely to actually get something out of it. Whereas if you are a stock person who owns a stock, it's just like, well, bad luck, or you're just going to be the one who's less down the line. Which means that oftentimes they're already willing to actually give these loans. Now, why do they in the status quo then still want to buy, for example, equity? The idea is that they believe that this company is going to do so well that even if they can make money from loans, because again, you need to pay interest rate over this, or they can just, have some power over you or that kind of stuff, they still believe that's even more they can get. So again, they believe that the stock